Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with that indefinable feeling that something fundamental is quietly transforming around us? We live in an age where technological and social changes move so fast and so loudly that we barely have time to process them, while deeper transformations occur in subtler layers of society, almost imperceptible amid the constant noise. One of these silent yet potentially revolutionary transformations is happening at the intersection of femininity, power, and spirituality. For centuries, the great spiritual traditions were dominated by male voices and patriarchal structures, while feminine spirituality often existed in the shadows, between the lines, in domestic practices and small communities, far from the spotlight of official history. But now, as we move toward a future increasingly defined by technology and data, something curious is happening. Feminine spirituality, instead of disappearing, as many might have predicted in a supposedly post-religious world, is emerging as a quiet and powerful force that could reshape our understanding of what it means to be human in the age of artificial intelligence and biotechnology. If we look to the distant past, to the hunter-gatherer societies that dominated 99% of human history, we find evidence of belief systems where the feminine occupied a central place. Paleolithic figurines of female figures with prominent breasts, hips, and bellies have been found throughout Europe and Asia, suggesting an ancient recognition of the feminine power to generate and sustain life. We don't know exactly how these societies interpreted spirituality, but archaeological artifacts suggest that the feminine principle was revered as a fundamental cosmic force. As humans developed agriculture about 12,000 years ago, we began to see a gradual transition to pantheons dominated by male gods and patriarchal power structures. Societies based on agriculture, property, and warfare tended to favor values traditionally associated with masculinity: domination, hierarchy, and conquest. The great religions that arose in this context, from Judaism to Islam, from Christianity to Brahminical Hinduism, from Confucianism to institutional Buddhism, were all initially structured and led by men, with theologies that often placed male deities at the center, or, in the case of non-theistic religions, established monastic hierarchies dominated by men. However, even within these patriarchal traditions, there have always been underground currents of feminine spirituality. Think of medieval Christian mystics like Hildegard of Bingen or Julian of Norwich, who had powerful visions and wrote revolutionary theological texts at a time when women rarely had a voice in the church. Or of the tantric traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, which recognized the feminine principle as the primordial energy of the universe. Or of the priestesses and shamans of countless indigenous traditions who maintained a living connection to feminine forms of spiritual knowledge. These traditions never disappeared completely, but flowed like underground streams, moving silently beneath the dominant structures of official religious history. With the rise of modern science and the Enlightenment over the past few centuries, many predicted the inevitable decline of religion and spirituality altogether. The famous sociologist Max Weber spoke of the disenchantment of the world as a consequence of the scientific and bureaucratic rationalization of modern society. And indeed, in many parts of the world, especially in Europe and highly developed societies, we've seen a steady decline in traditional religious participation. The great cathedrals of Europe now serve more as tourist attractions than centers of devotion. Monasteries that for centuries were centers of learning and spirituality now stand empty or have been converted into boutique hotels and secular retreat centers. In the United States, a traditionally religious country, the number of people who identify with no religion, the so-called nones, grows every year, especially among the young. But it would be a mistake to confuse the decline of traditional religious institutions with the disappearance of spirituality as a fundamental dimension of human experience. What we are witnessing is not so much the end of spirituality, but its transformation and redistribution through new channels and forms of expression. And curiously, in this reorganization of the spiritual landscape, women are emerging as protagonists in ways that would have been difficult to imagine in earlier eras. Recent data show a fascinating pattern. While men tend to abandon religion altogether when they leave traditional institutions, becoming atheists or agnostics, women are much more likely to migrate toward alternative forms of spirituality. We see this in the explosive growth of practices such as yoga, meditation, astrology, tarot, urban shamanism, and various movements of so-called New Age spirituality. These practices, though diverse in their origins and expressions, share certain characteristics that make them particularly appealing to contemporary sensibilities, especially feminine ones. They tend to value direct experience over institutional authority, intuition over dogma, connection over hierarchy, and immanence over transcendence. In other words, they offer a form of spirituality that naturally aligns with values traditionally associated with the feminine. Of course, we should be cautious about overgeneralizations regarding masculine and feminine. These categories are, for the most part, cultural constructions that vary greatly between different societies and eras. Not all women identify with the same forms of spirituality, and many men are drawn to practices traditionally labeled as feminine. Still, demographic data are clear. The new forms of spirituality flourishing on the fringes of contemporary culture are predominantly practiced by women. What explains this trend? Why, in an age of unprecedented scientific advances and growing secularization, are so many women seeking new forms of spiritual expression? And what does this tell us about the future of human spirituality in a world increasingly dominated by technology? One possible explanation lies in the history of women's marginalization within dominant religious traditions. For centuries, women were excluded from positions of religious authority in most major traditions. They could not be priests, rabbis, or imams. Their voices were silenced, their experiences devalued, their bodies deemed impure or dangerous. It's not surprising that as women gained greater social and economic autonomy in recent centuries, many chose to abandon institutions that historically marginalized them. But instead of rejecting the spiritual dimension altogether, many are reclaiming it on their own terms, creating new forms of practice and community that honor their unique experiences and perspectives. Another explanation lies in the distinctive characteristics of the feminine spirituality that is emerging. Unlike traditional religions, which often emphasize obedience to external authorities and sacred texts, new spiritualities tend to value the authority of personal experience and intuition. Instead of a transcendent and distant divinity, they celebrate the sacred as immanent present in the natural world, in human bodies, and in everyday relationships. Instead of rigid hierarchies, they favor horizontal networks of sharing and mutual support. These features make them particularly well suited to a post-industrial, networked, and ecologically conscious world, one that demands new ways of relating to power, knowledge, and community. But perhaps the deepest explanation lies in the unique existential crisis we face in the 21st century. We are living through an unprecedented era of transition where technologies such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and virtual reality are rapidly transforming what it means to be human. Algorithms now know our desires better than we do. Genetic editing promises to give us the power to redesign life, including our own. Automation is eliminating entire categories of human work. Amid these dizzying changes, fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and identity are becoming increasingly urgent. What makes us human when machines can think? What gives our lives meaning when traditional roles are disappearing? How do we remain connected to one another in a world increasingly mediated by technology? The great traditional religions, with their origins in agrarian and pre-scientific eras, often struggle to offer convincing answers to these questions. Their cosmologies and ethics were developed for worlds radically different from ours. At the same time, scientific materialism, with its view of the universe as a purposeless mechanism and consciousness as a mere byproduct of matter, leaves many people with a sense of existential emptiness, a disenchanted universe where nothing truly matters. In this context, the emerging forms of feminine spirituality offer something deeply necessary: a path toward re-enchantment, toward reconnection with meaning in a technological world, not by rejecting science or technology, but by finding ways to integrate them into a broader, richer vision of reality, one that honors subjective experience, intuition, and the interconnectedness of all things. Consider, for example, the growing popularity of practices such as mindfulness, meditation, and yoga. Originally developed within specific religious contexts, Buddhism and Hinduism, respectively, these practices have been adapted to the contemporary secular world and are now supported by a growing body of scientific research documenting their physical and mental health benefits. They provide a counterbalance to the fragmenting demands of digital life, allowing people to recultivate mindful attention and embodied presence in a world of constant distraction. And it is predominantly women who are leading these practices as teachers, practitioners, and spiritual entrepreneurs. Or consider the renewed interest in astrology, especially among millennial and Gen Z women. Easy to dismiss as irrational pseudoscience, astrology actually serves important psychological and social functions for many of its practitioners. It offers a language for understanding and discussing personality traits, emotions, and relationships. It provides rituals and practices for marking time in natural cycles, contrasting with the linear and mechanical time that dominates our professional lives. And it creates communities of shared meaning, something increasingly rare in our atomized societies. Whether these practices are scientifically verifiable in the strict sense is, for many practitioners, less important than the value they provide as tools for self-understanding and connection. Or think about the growing popularity of various earth-based spirituality movements, from neo-paganism to revitalized indigenous practices to the veneration of Mother Earth or Pachamama. In an era of accelerating climate crisis, these traditions offer not only rituals and mythologies that celebrate the sacredness of the natural world, but also ethics of care and environmental responsibility. It is no coincidence that the global climate justice movement includes a disproportionately high number of women among its ranks, from Greta Thunberg to Vandana Shiva. The interconnection between feminine spirituality and ecological activism is one of the most significant and potentially transformative trends of our time. These trends raise an intriguing question. Could we be witnessing not just a transformation, but a feminization of human spirituality? And if we are, what might the implications be for our collective future? To explore this question, we need to look at the broader forces reshaping our world. One of the most profound transformations of recent centuries has been the gradual shift from economies based on physical strength to economies based on information and services. In the agrarian and early industrial eras, economic value was created primarily through the application of physical force to transform the material environment, whether plowing fields or operating factory machines. These were activities in which, on average, men held a biological advantage due to greater physical strength. But in the information economy, value is created primarily through the manipulation of symbols, communication, and relationship management areas, where women are, on average, at least as capable as men, and in some respects, possibly more so. We see this shift reflected in educational statistics. In almost every developed country, women now surpass men in university enrollment and graduation rates. We also see it in the labor market, where professions traditionally dominated by women, such as healthcare and education, are among the fastest growing, while many traditionally male-dominated professions are in decline due to automation. The rise of the care economy is increasingly valuing qualities traditionally associated with femininity, such as empathy, communication, and emotional intelligence. Parallel to these economic changes, we are witnessing transformations in how we think about leadership and power. The authoritarian, hierarchical model of leadership based on command and control and historically associated with masculinity is increasingly being challenged by more collaborative, empathetic, and network-based models historically associated with femininity. Studies show that these more feminine leadership styles are often more effective in modern complex organizations, especially in knowledge and creativity-based sectors. These trends suggest that far from being a marginal curiosity, the feminization of spirituality may be part of a much broader cultural transformation, one that increasingly values qualities traditionally associated with the feminine in all spheres of life. And this transformation may be precisely what we need to navigate the existential challenges of our age. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this spiritual transformation we are discussing resonates most with your own journey? Have you ever noticed within yourself a longing for forms of knowledge and connection that go beyond the purely rational and technical? I know that we often keep such reflections to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming irrational or old-fashioned in a world that celebrates technology and rationality above all else. But your longing for deeper meaning is valid and likely shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. I reconnect with a deeper dimension of life when your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these existential questions instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these longings together, we can begin to imagine pathways toward a more whole and fulfilled humanity. Let us consider the specific existential challenges that advanced technology presents to us. Artificial intelligence is rapidly becoming capable of performing not only physical tasks, but also cognitive ones that we once thought were uniquely human, diagnosing diseases, creating art, writing code, even holding convincing conversations. As algorithms become more sophisticated in imitating and possibly surpassing our intellectual capacities, what remains that is uniquely human. What gives us value and meaning in a world where much of what we do can be automated? Traditional answers to these questions often emphasize qualities such as creativity, emotion, and social connection aspects of human experience that resist reduction to algorithms. But this raises a deeper issue. If these irreducible qualities are precisely those that our technological societies have traditionally devalued in favor of calculative rationality, then we need a cultural transformation that reclaims and celebrates these dimensions of humanity. This is where emerging forms of feminine spirituality offer valuable insights. Spiritual traditions that value embodiment, intuition, relationship, and direct experience remind us that being human has never been merely a matter of information processing. It is about inhabiting a body, feeling, loving, and connecting. They offer us practices and perspectives for recultivating these neglected dimensions of our humanity, not as optional luxuries, but as essential aspects of what it means to be fully human. But the potential importance of emerging feminine spirituality goes beyond offering existential comfort in the face of automation. It may also provide crucial resources for addressing the ecological crisis, which is perhaps the defining challenge of our era. The paradigm of industrial modernity, with its emphasis on domination, exploitation, and control of nature, lies at the root of our current environmental crisis. This paradigm is deeply intertwined with particular conceptions of masculinity that emerged during the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, conceptions that viewed the conquest of nature as a heroic masculine imperative. By contrast, many emerging spiritual traditions emphasize the interconnection of all living beings, the sacredness of the earth, and an ethic of care and responsibility toward the natural world. They invite us to see ourselves not as masters, separate from nature, but as participants in an interdependent web of life. This shift in perspective from domination to participation is precisely what many ecologists and environmental philosophers have identified as necessary to develop a sustainable relationship with the planet. The intersection between feminine spirituality and ecological awareness is particularly evident in movements such as ecofeminism, which sees deep connections between the domination of women and the exploitation of nature, and works to liberate, both through new ways of thinking and living that honor the interconnection of all beings. Far from being a fringe movement, ecofeminism has profoundly influenced global discourse on sustainability, with figures like Vandana Shiva and Wangari Maathai leading initiatives that integrate environmental justice, women's empowerment, and the revitalization of indigenous knowledge. Likewise, the growing emphasis on emotional intelligence and mindfulness in corporate and educational environments can be seen as a feminization of institutional culture. These approaches recognize that human intelligence has never been purely cognitive, but also emotional, social, and embodied. By integrating these more holistic dimensions of intelligence into our institutions, we can create more humane and effective organizations capable of addressing the complex challenges of our time. Some people may view these trends with alarm, fearing that they represent a rejection of rationality and scientific progress. But this is a misunderstanding. Emerging feminine spirituality does not reject science or technology. It seeks to integrate them into a broader and richer understanding of reality. It is not a regression to a pre-modern past, but a progression toward a post-dualistic future where reason and intuition, mind and body, human and natural, are not seen as opposites, but as complementary dimensions of an interconnected whole. Indeed, some of the most fascinating conversations today are happening at the intersections of advanced science and spirituality. Consider how the discoveries of quantum physics about the fundamentally relational nature of reality resonate with the visions of many spiritual traditions, or how neuroscience research is validating the profound effects of practices such as meditation and mindfulness on the brain and nervous system, or how ecology and evolutionary biology are revealing the interdependence of all living beings in ways that echo the views of many indigenous and earth-based spiritual traditions. These convergences point to the possibility of a new synthesis, one that integrates the insights of modern science with the perennial wisdom of spiritual traditions, especially those that have been marginalized by the dominant culture. And women, by virtue of their unique position at the crossroads of multiple forms of knowledge and experience, are well positioned to lead this integration. Of course, this process of transformation and integration will not be easy or linear. We face powerful resistance, both from traditional religious institutions that may see new spiritualities as threats to their authority, and from strict materialist secularism that distrusts any form of spiritual thought. We must also remain vigilant against the tendencies toward commodification and superficiality that can hollow out deep spiritual practices, turning them into mere consumer products or self-optimization techniques. Moreover, we must recognize that spirituality, like all dimensions of human culture, is shaped by forces of power and privilege. White, educated, and economically privileged women have far more freedom to explore new spiritual forms than women struggling with poverty, discrimination, or political oppression. And the problematic appropriations of indigenous spiritual practices by Western spiritual seekers raise serious questions about cultural colonialism and exploitation. Therefore, if emerging feminine spirituality is truly to offer paths of transformation for our collective future, it must remain attentive to these power dynamics and actively work to create forms of spiritual practice that are accessible, inclusive, and respectful of cultural diversity. It must resist the temptation of escapism, recognizing that true spiritual transformation does not take us away from the world and its problems, but draws us more deeply into them, equipping us with the inner resources to work for justice and healing. What might seem at first glance like a mere peripheral cultural phenomenon, the growing attraction of women to alternative forms of spirituality reveals itself upon closer examination. As part of a much deeper cultural transformation, one with the potential to fundamentally reshape our relationship with ourselves, with each other, with technology, and with the planet. The qualities traditionally associated with femininity, relationality, intuition, care, receptivity to direct experience are precisely the qualities we must cultivate to navigate the existential challenges of our era. This is not a matter of women versus men, or feminine versus masculine, but of rebalancing qualities that have been artificially divided and hierarchized by our cultural histories. All human beings, regardless of gender, possess capacities for rationality and intuition, autonomy and connection, assertiveness and receptivity. The emerging feminine spirituality does not seek to reverse existing hierarchies by placing the feminine above the masculine, but rather to dissolve these false dichotomies, allowing a fuller and more integrated expression of our shared humanity. And it is precisely this integration that we need to face the unprecedented challenges of our time. In the face of increasingly powerful technologies and accelerating ecological crises, neither a strictly materialist rationalism nor a rigid religious traditionalism offers sufficient answers. We need new syntheses, new ways of being and knowing that can embrace the complexity and interconnection of our reality. The silent spirituality of the women of the future may not remain silent for long. As more women find their voices, authority, and power in spiritual realms, their intuitions and practices are gradually permeating broader culture, offering resources to re-enchant our technological world, reconnect with the web of life, and recover dimensions of our humanity that have been neglected by industrial modernity. Of course, the future remains uncertain. There are no guarantees that these trends of the feminization of spirituality will continue or have the transformative effects envisioned here. Powerful forces are at play that could lead our species in very different, some even dark, directions. The growing political polarization, the resurgence of authoritarianism, cascading environmental crises, and the development of potentially dangerous technologies such as superintelligent AI and autonomous weapons all pose real threats to human civilization and to the planet itself. But even in the face of these challenges, or perhaps precisely because of them, the need for new forms of spirituality to help us navigate these turbulent times becomes even more acute. And the emerging forms of feminine spirituality, with their emphasis on interconnection, embodiment, and direct intuition, offer valuable resources for that undertaking. Perhaps the future belongs neither to traditional religions with their rigid hierarchies and pre-scientific cosmologies, nor to a strictly materialist secularism that reduces all reality to particles and forces. Perhaps it belongs to new syntheses that integrate the best of both traditions, along with long marginalized wisdoms, into more inclusive and integrative visions of what it means to be human. And perhaps women, due to their historical position on the margins of dominant power systems, are particularly well positioned to lead this integration, bringing forth knowledge and perspectives that have been systematically devalued but now prove crucial for our collective future. Returning to our original question, have you ever felt that sensation in the middle of the night that something fundamental is changing? Perhaps what you felt was not just anxiety or uncertainty, but the intuition of a new world being born, a world in which the qualities traditionally associated with the feminine are no longer marginalized, but central to our survival and flourishing as a species. A world where spirituality is not separated from science or politics, but integrated with them into a more holistic vision of reality and our place within it. As human beings, we are both evolutionary and symbolic creatures. We evolve biologically through mutation and natural selection, but also culturally through the creation and transformation of systems of meaning. The great spiritual traditions of human history are some of our most sophisticated meaning systems, distilling centuries of perception and experience into myths, rituals, and practices that deeply shape how we experience and interact with reality. Today, we face evolutionary challenges that require new forms of meaning, new stories to guide our relationship with ourselves, with one another, and with the planet. The feminization of spirituality can be seen as part of this cultural evolutionary process, an adaptive response to the unique conditions of our time. The stories we tell matter. They shape what we perceive as possible or impossible, what we value or devalue, what we consider knowledge or illusion. For millennia, our dominant spiritual stories have been told mainly through male voices, emphasizing themes of transcendence, hierarchy, and separation. Now, new voices are being heard, telling stories of immanence, interconnection, and integration. It is a seismic shift in our spiritual landscape, as significant as any advanced technology in its potential to reshape our future. And just like technology, spirituality can be used for good or for harm, for liberation or for control. It depends on us individually and collectively to cultivate and direct these emerging energies toward paths that promote human flourishing, social justice, and ecological sustainability. This is not a task for religious experts or spiritual leaders alone, but for all of us as participants in the ongoing cultural evolution of our species. The silent spirituality of the women of the future is a call to all of us, regardless of gender, to reclaim dimensions of our humanity that have been neglected or repressed by the dominant forces of industrial modernity. It is an invitation to a richer, more integrated understanding of what it means to be human in a time of technological transformation and unprecedented ecological crisis. It is a reminder that in the end, technology is only a tool, and that the most important questions we face are not technical, but existential. How to live meaningfully, how to relate compassionately, and how to create ways of being that honor the precious web of life to which we belong. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling but perhaps couldn't yet put into words, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era, not only seeking understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided but also offers unprecedented opportunities for evolution and transformation. The qualities we traditionally associate with the feminine care, connection, intuition, receptivity to direct experience are not merely beautiful optional additions to human life, but essential resources for our survival and flourishing in the face of the existential challenges of our era. Emerging feminine spirituality, far from being a marginal phenomenon or a mere symptom of religious decline, can be seen as an evolutionary response to the unique conditions of our time, offering pathways to reintegrate science and spirit, reason and intuition, technology and wisdom into a fuller, more sustainable vision of what it means to be human on the threshold of an unknown future. It is a vision of hope in uncertain times, a reminder that even as external structures seem to crumble, new forms of meaning and connection are emerging quietly yet powerfully from the depths of our shared humanity. And in these new forms, we may find the resources to face together the unprecedented challenges of our age, not with fear or despair, but with courage, wisdom, and love.
Some of our closest relatives in nature, the bonobo chimpanzees. Yeah, maybe the bonobo males would like to control the female bonobos, but they just can't. In bonobo society, networks of females actually dominate the society. Now, lots of people have this very simplistic notion that men are simply stronger physically. So, it's no-brainer. But actually, this is a very problematic theory, because when you look at human societies, there is no consistent match between physical strength and social and political power.
Most information in the world is junk.
In just a word or two, explain why modern AI might destroy democracy.
The key issue is that democracy is based on trust, whereas dictatorship is based on terror. This extremely cynical view of humans is not true.
What you've done in your recent book, Nexus.
The book is about the history of information.
To offer a different lens for information.
Information isn't truth. It's not a question of helpful or dangerous. It's the magnitude of the change. We need more boring politicians, for instance.
For sure.
Suffering is the rejection of reality. One of the last stories that still connects everybody is the story of money.
This whole problem becomes much greater with AI.
AIs can make decisions. They are not just tools in our hands, they are agents, creating new realities.
$7,000, $25,000 unarmed civilian. She keep it light,
The key issue is that democracy is based on trust, whereas dictatorship is based on terror. If you systematically destroy trust in institutions, destroy trust in the media, in academia, in the courts, and so forth, some people think that this is liberating the people from these institutions.
Right.
It's not. When you destroy all trust, the only thing that can still work is a dictatorship. Right. So this is what would-be dictators do. They systematically destroy trust. And the other thing to realize is that the vast majority of information is not truth. A key misconception, especially in places like Silicon Valley, is to equate information with truth. Most information is junk. Because, to write a truthful story, you need to invest a lot of time and effort and money in research and fact-checking, whereas fiction is very, very cheap.